Hello. Hi, it's so great to be here with all of you today. And if we could just get the slides up. Hi. So I wanted to start by sharing with you the story of how I came to be a quiet revolutionary in the first place, because I think for most people who wage a kind of revolution, they start in their childhoods when they start realizing that things are not the way they think they're supposed to be. So for me, it started when I was about 9 years old, and I went off to summer camp for the first time. And my mother packed me a suitcase full of books, which in our house seemed like a very natural thing to do if you were going off to the woods for 8 weeks. But when I got there, the camp counselor gathered us around, and she said that she was going to teach us a cheer which we would be performing for the rest of the summer. And I thought I would perform the cheer for you today. And if any of you have seen my TED Talk, you might want to even say it along with me. The cheer went like this. It went, R-O-W-D-I-E, that's the way we spell rowdy, rowdy. Rowdy, let's get rowdy. And I couldn't figure out for the life of me, why did we have to be so rowdy all the time? And why did we have to spell this word incorrectly? But, I just recited the cheer along with everybody else, and I kept on reciting it all summer long, and for the rest of the summer I was kind of trying to be my best version of a rowdy camper and an extroverted camper, and I did this not only for the rest of the summer, but I really did this for the rest of my childhood, and the rest of my adulthood, really, too. And so I ended up becoming, for a while, a corporate lawyer, instead of the writer that I had always longed to be, partly because I was trying to be this more extroverted version of myself. And I came to believe that this was a big mistake, that it was a mistake to try to be somebody who I was not. But more than that, it was a mistake that we are all making as a culture. It's a mistake when we try to ask introverts to be extroverts. Now, this statistic might come as a surprise to you, but 1/3 to 1/2 of the population is introverted. 1/3 to 1/2, so that's 1 out of every 2 or 3 people you know. And we are not making the most of these people's hearts and minds. And that's really what I want to talk to you about today. But before we do that, I think we should start by asking you to think about who you really are. Where do you fall on the introvert-extrovert spectrum? So in my book, Quiet, I developed a personality test that helps you answer this question, but we don't really have time to get into that test right now, so we're going to get at this in a much more unorthodox way. I just shared with you a story from my childhood that illustrates who I really am. And I'm going to ask each of you right now to break up very briefly into groups of 4 and to share with your group a story from your childhood that you think illustrates who you really are. And then we're going to ask each group to select the most personal and private and poignant of each of these stories and share them with the room as a whole. And from this group process, a larger truth will emerge. And I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. We're not going to do any such thing. But I really want you to think about what were you thinking and how were you feeling during the brief moments where you're like, oh my God, I think she's serious. Were you thinking perhaps extroverts among you? This is great. I have the chance to briefly chat with my colleagues instead of sitting and listening rather passively to a speech. Or introverts, perhaps you were thinking, how can I get out of here right now without insulting the speaker? And I saw the looks on some of your faces, so I know this was going through your minds. And of course, I put you through this momentary torture just to make the point that introverts are forever being obliged to participate in these kinds of group exercises, though that's not, how they usually choose to spend their time. This is not to say that introverts don't like to work for the sake of a group. In fact, we know from management research, introverts tend to be unusually cooperative, but they like the kind of group work where people kind of go off and work on their discrete piece of the puzzle, and then you come back and rationally share what you've learned. Okay, but let's now really think about who you are, and I promise no trick questions here. The real difference between introverts and extroverts is how do you respond to stimulation. So introverts feel at their most alive and their most charged and in their deepest state of equilibrium when there is less stimulation, by which I don't mean less intellectual stimulation. I just mean kind of less stuff happening at any given time. This is why introverts would prefer a glass of wine with a close friend as opposed to a big party full of strangers. It's less stimulating. Extroverts, you crave stimulation, and when you're not getting enough of it, you feel bored and listless and unhappy. And these differences extend way beyond how we socialize. So, there was a famous study by the psychologist Russell Cain. He gave math problems to introverts and extroverts to solve with varying levels of background noise playing. And he found that the introverts did best when the background noise was lowest, and the extroverts did best when the background noise was loudest. And that is a profound bit of research for those of us who care about the way people think and thrive and create and flourish, because what it's saying is there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all world. There's no such thing. If we want people thriving at their best, we need to create environments where you can choose the amount of stimulation that's coming at you. So very quickly now, how many of you would describe yourselves as introverts? Okay, it can't be 100% of this audience. So let's do this the other way. How many of you would describe yourselves as extroverts? Oh my gosh, okay. Okay, so it really is about 50-50, which is exactly what the most recent study has said of the US population. Okay, now I want to kind of take you through the life and times of introverts and extroverts so you can see how these things play out. We're going to start in childhood. You're looking at a picture of a Mommy and Me class where kids sit around and sing songs and play musical instruments. If you look at this picture from a hazy, impressionistic perspective, it looks like it's a picture of just a happy group of caregivers and kids. But if you look at it more closely, you see the fundamentals of human social dynamics. Because what you see is that some of the children are clinging rather closely to their parents' sides, and others of the children, like the little guy in the red jumpsuit in the middle of the room, he has no idea where his mom is. And that's perfectly okay with him. He's a more kind of bold, exploratory character. The silent narrative that is often playing in the minds of the mothers of the quieter children, it's often a narrative of worry. It's a narrative that says, my child seems not to be getting as much out of this experience, and maybe that's going to be the story of my child's life. But what I want to say to these parents is there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye, because the children who are clinging and not saying anything, they're not sitting there passively. They are paying a kind of close and acute attention to what's going on. And eventually they will join in. For some it's going to take days, for some weeks, for some months. But when they do, they will have a greater understanding of what's going on, and they'll have a kind of close, subtle understanding of the social dynamics that they're joining. And this style of paying subtle attention to what is going on around them stays with introverted children as they grow older. So when they're a little older, if you give them this kind of a puzzle to solve, where you have two very similar-looking pictures, and the job is to discern the subtle differences between them, introverted children do better on puzzles like these. And in the lab, you can literally see their eyes darting back and forth more frequently, comparing the two pictures. Now, this style is going to stay with them as they grow older. So I want to talk to you briefly about famous introverts and famous extroverts. You're looking here first at famous introverts. You've got Albert Einstein on the left, who famously said, "It's not that I'm so smart, it's that I stay with problems longer." It's the way introverts take in information. In the middle is Wendy Kopp, who founded Teach for America and later Teach for All. She's an amazing leader. And she told me that she understood from a very early age that she would never be a leader by galvanizing force of personality. She said she leads through grit and she leads through ideas. Grit and ideas. And then on the right, we have Warren Buffett, also self-described introvert, really well known for spending many hours alone in his office poring over financial documents, also well known for getting along beautifully with colleagues, appointing great managers under him who help him run his company. So it's kind of this mix of a solitary and collaborative style. Now I want to show you some famous extroverts. And we're looking here at Jack Welch, at Oprah Winfrey, at Sheryl Sandberg. And what I want you to see, to notice about each of these pictures is the broad smiles on all these people's faces, right? Now, what's going on with that? There's a kind of energy, there's a kind of dynamism that makes us feel as if they're going to jump right out of these screens and come in and stand with us right here in person. And, it turns out there's really interesting early research on the neurobiology of introverts and extroverts. Now, we all have in our brains reward networks, and this is the networks in our brains that get activated and excited at the prospect of something appealing. So it could be an attractive stranger across the room, or it could be a business deal you're excited about doing. Your reward networks get excited. And extroverts have more easily activated reward networks than introverts do. It's not to say that introverts don't have them, but it's just, it takes them a little longer to get into that space. And so this is why there is such a wonderful synchronicity between our culture that says, just do it and seize the day. There's a synchronicity between that cultural style and the literal brain chemistry of extroverts. There's much more of a mismatch between the way introverts look at things, which is a kind of look before you leap style, and our culture. But if you think about it, we desperately need both of these types, and in an ideal world, we need both of these types really working together. And in fact, what you see when you look at many successful companies is exactly that. So staying with Sheryl Sandberg for a minute, at Facebook we have Sheryl Sandberg, COO, famously highly extroverted woman, and Mark Zuckerberg, famously introverted CEO. And they work together beautifully because they each have different temperaments and respect each other's domains. Now, I want to talk about how this plays out in terms of creativity. We have an idea now in our culture that creativity emerges from a very gregarious place. But in fact, when psychologists look at who have been the most creative people over time, they almost always find people who are extroverted enough that they can get out and exchange ideas and advance ideas, and they're also introverted enough that they can stay in solitude by themselves. And so you're looking here at Philippe Starck, who says that, he's one of the great designers of our time. He says that every year from May until September, he goes off by himself, and he doesn't go to any parties, he doesn't read any magazines, nothing, because he knows that he wants to be alone and be able to figure out what are the ideas that he and he alone knows about. Now, lots of interesting research on the power of solitude. One interesting thing to tell you about is that brainstorming doesn't work. 40 years of research on brainstorming, individuals who brainstorm by themselves produce more ideas and better ideas than groups who brainstorm together. Now, I want to talk to you also about leadership. How many of you have heard of the idea of level 5 leadership? Okay, it's just a handful of you. And this comes from the work of Jim Collins, who did a famous study where he looked at the top 11 best performing companies in the country, and he wanted to figure out what set these companies apart from their more mediocre peers. And he found that every single one of these companies was led by a leader who had two qualities. On the one hand, they had this great sense of will and passion and determination, and on the other hand, they were described as shy, as quiet, as modest, as low-key, as unassuming, as soft-spoken. This whole constellation of qualities that are really the very opposite of what we normally associate with leadership. So what's going on with that? Well, if you look at the way introverts operate, they usually get really excited about one or two or three ideas, and they devote themselves to those ideas or crafts or passions or businesses, whatever it happens to be. And in the service of those passions, they end up ascending to leadership positions. So if you look around you, all over Silicon Valley, you see lots of these leaders. Larry Page at Google, Marissa Mayer at Yahoo. These were all quiet, shy people who kind of grew up and in the service of their love for technology came to the positions they now hold. This is Douglas Conant, who was, until recently, the CEO of Campbell Soup, much beloved figure, shy, introverted guy. You see him here in this picture writing a letter. During his time at Campbell, he was famous for identifying the employees who had really made a difference. And then he would sit down and he would write to these people personal letters of thanks. And during his time at Campbell, he wrote 30,000 of these personal letters. 30,000 letters, which, that's amazing. It's an amazing number of letters. It's not the way an extroverted leader would think of communicating or expressing gratitude. It's the way an introverted leader found to do it. We all find our different ways. The point is that there's no one right way. There's lots of ways to get there. And then finally, Gandhi, who was so shy as a child. He used to run home from school every day as soon as class was over because he didn't want to have to talk to his classmates. And he remained this way for the rest of his life. He remained this way. He said in his autobiography, he talks about it at great length, he talks about how his shyness was his greatest source of strength. It gave him restraint and it gave him a kind of focus on the things that mattered. And people who were lined up behind the same cause could kind of feel that he was there, not because he enjoyed the spotlight, quite the contrary. He was there kind of because he had to be. Now, in closing, I have so much more to tell you, but I want to leave you with a few concrete ideas that you can bring into your lives. So 3 things to know for kind of introvert, extrovert nirvana and really getting along well with each other. The first thing to know is, as introverts and as extroverts, you all really experience meetings incredibly differently. So extroverts at a meeting will often feel, understandably, as if the introverts sitting next to them, they know that they have lots of good ideas, and yet they're not saying anything. So the extroverts understandably feel like, well, is this person out of touch? Is this person aloof? Are they disengaged? What's going on? And the introverts often feel as if by the time they thought of the thing that they wanted to say, the meeting was over. So that's a problem. So just a few things to know about this. Extroverts, if you want to hear the best of introverts' brains, probably the best thing to do is not to call a meeting, but rather to talk one-on-one and ideally to give advance notice of the thing that you want to talk about, because introverts, by definition, like to think before they speak, right? They want to process things before they talk about them. And introverts, here's what you can do. Before meetings, think about what you're going to say, prepare what you're going to say, and then when you get there, speak up early. Push yourselves to be one of the first people to speak, because what that does is it puts you into the center of the room. It puts you there technically, but it also puts you there psychologically. And it decreases the anticipatory anxiety of being the person who hasn't spoken yet. And then by the time you do, you feel as if all eyes are on you. So just give yourself that little push. Now, second thing to know, introverts and extroverts, you handle conflict really differently. So extroverts tend to be what psychologists call confrontive copers. They want to deal with the issue head on. They want to really talk about it and hammer it out. And if things get a little heated, that's okay, because it's in the service of solving the problem. Introverts are different. Introverts want usually to diffuse the sense of conflict in the room. And so they will tend to get muted at a time of conflict. And this can lead to incredible misunderstandings. If you think of marriages, if you think of business relationships, if you have introverts feeling as if, as the extroverts get louder, the introverts feel that they're aggressed upon. The extroverts, on the other hand, feel as if when the introverts get muted, that they're tuning out, and the extroverts start to feel abandoned, and as if the introvert doesn't care. So it's crucial to understand these differences in each other's styles, not take them personally, but try to work through them. And then, finally, this is a big one, to understand that introverts and extroverts really express enthusiasm differently. The two types feel equal amounts of enthusiasm, but introverts tend to be quieter about it. Extroverts are more expressive about it. So I want to just tell you this story from my own personal life. My husband, my beloved husband, is an extrovert. And when we first met was when I was first trying to start writing. And I hadn't yet started writing my book, Quiet. I was experimenting with many different genres. And at the time I met him, I had been working on a memoir that I was writing in sonnet form. I was writing it in poetic verse. And I showed it to him. And I'm sharing it with you here, the email that he wrote to me after he read it. It was like, holy shit, and write, women, write. And he said all these things that made me feel like, wow, I really have to keep going. It was incredibly expressive and enthusiastic of him. And I love that about him. Now, what I have to remember, in contrast to that, is when he does something that's really wonderful, I need to remind myself to express my enthusiasm in a style that at least approximates his, because if I don't do that, then he can feel as if I'm not actually that enthusiastic about it, right? Like, we have to remind ourselves to match the style a little bit, or at least get halfway there, matching the style of the person who we are in a relationship with, whether it's a romantic relationship or a friendship or a business relationship. Just to be mindful of these things. And then finally, I wanted to say to you, kind of in a really broad way, that we really are talking about a quiet revolution here. And we're talking about the next great diversity issue of our time. we all know the case for gender diversity. We know the case for racial diversity. We know the case for national diversity, ethnic diversity. We know that these are moral issues, but also that these are issues that affect the bottom line. And the same exact thing is true when it comes to personality diversity. We desperately need the talents of the bold and the gregarious among us, and we need the talents of the quiet, careful thinkers. And the beauty of it is that this doesn't cost a lot of money, and this doesn't take a lot of time. All this takes is thinking a little bit differently about what it means to be quiet. So, thank you very much. Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here with you today. And I hope you have a great rest of the day.